self tuner, 528 hertz. I wonder if we can see 528 hertz. If we can see sound, if we can see the sound of love, or if we can see love and speak love through direct perception. No idea. I feel like self-dialogue is real science. We think science is working for 10 years on one paper that most people can't understand. Whereas if we can speak with ourselves and develop direct perception of things, we don't really need science. There's a different type of science called science, SCEYENCE. It's the science of the eyes, of seeing clearly, and we can also hypothesize, also spelled with EYE. It's a way of humanizing information within oneself versus how we try to absorb things mechanically and turn ourselves into mechanisms through scientific facts. There's the facts we can see with our own eyes if we're not blinded by our mechanized thought process. I skimmed through an article by Dr. Mercola, and he's talking about the importance of movement. And I talked about this before, and he talks about it a lot because it's one of his main things is movement. And he says that if we're not moving, there's BNF in the brain, which is bone neurotropic factor, something like that. And if we're moving, there's actually something in the brain they discovered through rat studies called noggin. So noggin makes the brain cells grow, whereas BNF makes the brain atrophy. So he's saying exercise is actually important for brain growth. And it's interesting because if we're sedentary, we're going to have more BNF in our body. We're going to grow more bone tissue because our bones actually start to fuse together when we're not moving. And if we're sitting with our head forward all day long and we're not moving, it's going to fuse. So it makes sense that we have this bone generation factor in our blood if we're sedentary. But it's in our blood, so it's also in the blood in our brain. So in that way, being sedentary actually makes our brain atrophy just because we're not moving. So in movement, we're able to produce more brain cells, but I actually feel partly it's due to the fact there's more circulation. So when we're sedentary, there's no circulation, we grow bones. Whereas if we're moving, we don't need those extra bone supports because we're fluid, we're dynamic, we're meant to move. And I also extrapolate this to actually how our brain cells move. So if we're thinking the same repetitive thoughts, 60,000 thoughts a day, there might only be 100 thoughts on repeat. We're doing the equivalent of remaining stationary in our mind because we're stationary within those 100 thoughts. So how I relate this is to when I've talked about how the ego is actually scar tissue. It's actually thoughts we keep repeating, and it forms scar tissue. And we have very limited movement in terms of where our brain can go in order to think and see, because we're only seeing and thinking along the lines of our repetitive thoughts. So to me, exercise would increase movement, which increases blood flow, which allows the brain to grow. So that's physical exercise. I feel it's just as critical to actually be able to move the brain cells in many different ways, not just in the 100 thoughts that the brain thinks. Those few thoughts that we've used to clog up the RAM of our frontal cortex, and it's just going over and over. The brain has lost its fluidity. It has become rigid in its thinking. And it's not even thinking, it's just going along the same tracks that it's laid down through conditioning. And we see something, we remember it, we repeat it. Whatever it is that we repeat in our own voice becomes this habitual thought track that prevents us from seeing other things. It prevents us from seeing. And so what I'm saying is that seeing, perception, seeing something new, is a different movement that grows the brain. It actually provides oxygen to some other area of the brain because we just saw something. Even Dr. Bruce Lipton says perception writes genetics. So seeing something is going to change something genetically in the brain to create different brain cells, to create different neurons. So we're either moved by our conditioning through a very limited habit track, and then we think, oh, we need to create a few more habits, or we don't have those habits of thought and we can see clearly everything. And when we can see clearly everything, that everything is recreated and mirrored in our brain cells. And when our brain cells are growing, we have energy, we're learning, we're engaged, and that is joy, love, beauty, happiness. So the real thing is actually being able to see something new and see something anew, to see with new eyes. It's not about doing anything, it's about seeing with new eyes, because I could say, well, I'm going to do this and this is my plan. These are the 7 steps to this habit. And then I do that, and that actually puts blinders on. Or I see the falseness of that process and just see and perceive in the present moment. If we walk in a distorted way, and we continue to walk that way for the next 30 years, we're going to be stuck that way. We're going to be scarred that way. We're going to be distorted that way. Whereas if we move dynamically and we're always moving infinitely differently through the full range of motions of our body as a human being within the field of gravity, and understanding that field of gravity that we're in, our bodies are going to continue to be dynamic and fluid. They're not going to fuse. So same thing with thinking the same thoughts all the time. The brain fuses and congeals, and then we are very limited in the way that we can move about in the field of thought, in the field of consciousness. I feel the new game is actually to grow our brain cells, to work out our brain cells, and to make that also embodied. So growing our brain cells could include things like seeing something new. It could include getting more oxygen by being in the forest, for example. Seeing nature, which is more beautiful than looking at a screen all the time. Doing things that get the oxygen to the brain. I feel like ego thoughts actually starve the whole brain of oxygen. It sends it all to the prefrontal cortex and forms these scar tissues of neurons in there, abstracting about the same thing all the time and just living in those abstractions and not seeing reality. And reality is the whole brain. It's reflected in the whole brain. So we have to see with our whole brain, not just our abstractions about reality. And part of how we make it embodied is by having conversation and communication with other people, and the epigestretics and the endomimetics and the epimimetics, and making weems, so making the oxytocin through the inner human dimensions, because the oxytocin is what actually, we have the love feeling in the brain and then we get it also in the body, whereas dopamine is just in the brain from what I've read so far. And the oxytocin makes us want to gesture with our body. It makes us want to reach out and continue. It's a different reward. It's a reward of connection as opposed to dopamine, which is a reward of disconnection. And then we get more and more and more disconnected, and then we walk to a path where we're so scarred by our own thinking process and we take ourselves to be that some of us end our lives. I feel like the ego kills itself when the brain is that starved of oxygen that it can't see anything else. It's not oxygenating the rest of the brain. It can't see anything else but itself and its abstraction. And it goes so far into that's all it can see, and it sees the meaninglessness of it, and then that's the end. If a person can see beauty, they're not going to end their life. If a person can feel love, and these are things to do with oxytocin and connection, and earthing, connecting with the earth and sunshine also gets the blood flowing. I'm seeing a lot about this whole blood flow thing. It's almost like what we see is where the blood flow is directed in the brain. We're only seeing our abstractions. It's too directed to the prefrontal cortex, and then we say we use 5% of our brain because all of the blood supply is going to this abstracting process, this distracting process. It's distracting the blood flow from the rest of the brain, and then no wonder there's all these neurodegenerative diseases now where the brain is basically shriveling up. It's not getting any nutrition. Even the movie What the Bleep Do We Know, which was years ago, said that we become addicted to our emotions in our body, and then we have more receptors for those emotions than we do nutrients. So we're so busy giving the cells those emotions that is taking up the capacity to actually absorb the nutrition, because there's more receptors for the emotion than the actual molecules of nutrition. And I think the same thing happens in the brain with dopamine. Everything's going to that reflex, so the rest of the brain isn't being nourished. The body downregulates everything in favor of this dopamine because the brain is a perceptual apparatus, but we're only perceiving things that are giving the reward of dopamine. And then the rest of the brain, there's no energy going there. And so through this dopamine process, which eventually becomes dopaminingless, the me, seeing the meaninglessness of it all, sometimes ends itself through destroying the body. The brain has been destroyed, so the body gets destroyed too. I wrote something down. I wrote down that perception, which is light, and minerals are frequencies of light, leads to movement in the brain, which leads to blood flow, which leads to oxygen, which leads to energy. So perception is what unfolds life. And we don't even see what we're doing to ourselves. So why do we think we can see what the cosmos is doing? And sometimes we're released from seeing through that ego-me process, and we can kind of see what the cosmos is doing. It's pretty amazing. And the cosmos is playing with life, and we're destroying it. And I think about, again, what would a manic do? What would I do if I had nothing to do? And I was thinking about, at some point, doing an experiment where I go out and I just have nothing to do. I just leave the house and I just go based on intuition for the whole day, because that's something that a manic would do. Because normally we follow our thought processes and our habits. So if those are the things that are obstructing us in a lot of ways, how can I just go out and just be like a manic person would and just sort of follow one's heart? And the thing with that is then we have to actually pay attention. We have to pay attention to our heart. We have to pay attention to what we're perceiving. And in a way, this is a way to deprogram. Our movement in the field of gravity and space and time has become mechanical based on our programmed thoughts. And then we don't see anything. So if we go out without habit, we're looking for life. We actually have to respond to life and see that life creates life and that we are alive. And I can use an app to track where I go, kind of like how those studies track cats and where they go at night. Let perception move you. That could be a fundamental thing. Let perception move you. I don't know. And activating this other voice, this voice of intelligence, as opposed to the voice of the ego, which is words turned against us. Being able to utilize words to create the brain, to create brain cells, as opposed to create scar tissue in the brain through repetition. And even though repetition builds muscles in the field of gravity, repeating thoughts in the field of consciousness actually limits neural connections. The muscle cells are designed to get stronger, whereas brain cells are designed to get more complex. So if we're repeating, we're actually going against complexity. And gratitude probably increases blood flow to the brain. Right now, the highest quality for watching and recording things is 4K. And I had this thought that right now we're actually playing in C squared. Light, the speed of light squared, times mass, or love, as Einstein said. We're playing in C squared, which is a holographic process. We're playing in the light of the sun meets the light of our eyes, the light of our consciousness. What do we watch in C squared is more important than having the best 4K TV. What do we create in C squared? How do we arise in C squared? How do we make our brain grow within C squared? I feel like relationship heals in that it brings in another C, it brings in another light of consciousness. So it depends how that person is shining the light of their consciousness. It will actually change you. If somebody's judging you, you can tell, especially in map consciousness. Whereas if they're being unconditionally loving, you can also tell. And it changes your light. In mania, we often become very graceful. We're more fluid, we're more flexible, we're stronger, we move differently. And I feel like it's because that energy in our brain isn't being directed to the prefrontal cortex. It's not being directed to the ego. And when it's not being directed there, all of a sudden we shift to being this very dynamic and fluid version of ourselves, and it doesn't take time. It's just a matter of shift in awareness. So map consciousness is a shift in awareness. It's a shift in perception. We're not perceiving through that limited energy of the ego structure. And when we are perceiving through that, that is what contracts our body and condenses it and gets us moving as we would as our ego version of ourselves. So it's actually just a matter of energy flow. It's a matter of perception, which changes the flow of energy. So it's a matter of changing how we look, changing how we see with our eyes. And it's just a matter of seeing something new, which doesn't seem that difficult. It's making a new connection. Making a new connection, that's what extrapolation is. So today when I read that Mercola article, I probably only read a few sentences. And when I did, I extrapolated. And so that might be more important than actually sitting and reading the whole long article and trying to absorb what they're saying, is thinking of something new about what they're saying and maybe just reading a sentence or two. And not worrying about whether it's right or wrong. Because right or wrong, reward and punishment, that's all dopamine, and that's the thing we're actually trying to decouple from in map consciousness. We don't feel that sense of reward and punishment. We just feel like we're learning. And then when we come back to ego consciousness, we feel that sense of reward and punishment oftentimes amplified. It's almost like, how dare you not believe in reward and punishment? Now we're going to punish you. The answer is to question the programming, to see the programming. And by seeing the programming, those are the new eyes. Instead of seeing as the programming, seeing the programming. seeing that we're not that programming, that there's a dimension beyond. We have those degrees of freedom. By labeling us with mental illnesses, our brains are sold to the pharmaceutical industry. We're given the inner subjective experience in map consciousness so we can feel powerful, so we can feel the power of our own brains. Our brains are so powerful. It's connecting us with our inner superhero. And it probably only feels like superhero because we're not used to being like that. We felt like superheroes as kids, probably. And then we go back to feeling like superheroes. And it's just a feeling. Maybe the world would be a better place if more of us felt like that. If we didn't feel so disempowered. If our brains weren't so fried by the circuitry of repetition. Most things out there are giving us something to strive for. But we don't question the thing we're striving with. We're striving with this brain that's polluted and clogged with old thoughts and programs. I was thinking about gestures, and it's not the gesture, but it's also the perception of the gesture and the meaning of. So if I do a kind gesture but nobody sees it, it's not going to be perceived and the meaning's not going to be equated. Or if I do a gesture that's not culturally appropriate, some other culture sees that as a bad gesture, then there's also a miscommunication there. So map consciousness is trying to get us to produce new gestures, and it could just be the gesture of being dynamic and being not programmed. Non-programmed gestures as opposed to programmed gestures. And creating new gestures, which is epigesturetics. Because no amount of arranging thoughts in our head is going to solve the world's problems. We actually have to act. And it's actually getting us to act, and act dynamically. And in map consciousness, the light of our awareness can be directed anywhere instead of being directed to our dopamine circuits. And when that light can be directed anywhere, we can see. And map consciousness causes voice reversal. Instead of speaking from this internal voice, we're speaking from our perceptions. We're speaking from what we see. We speak from what we see instead of what we may. We don't know how to turn off autopilot. So one thing would be to notice when we are on autopilot. And when we notice we're on autopilot, we're no longer on autopilot. And MAP is trying to use atrophied areas of the brain. So if I was immobilized for 20 years, it would take me a long time to learn how to walk and get those muscles built again with blood flow. And ego consciousness is the same. It's like immobilizing most of our brain. So in a way, map consciousness is actually learning how to walk in a different world instead of a world of our own thoughts. And we need to actually move differently physically in order to walk in that world too. We can't move in habitual ways. So sometimes in map consciousness we fall over and it's like laying down again. But we can still get up and try again and practice. And this isn't a practice in terms of building a habit, it's a practice of not practicing. A practice of not being on autopilot, of not being a habit. Being a habit would be like, I'm going to make the habit of always saying donkeys are gray and horses are brown every time I meet up with somebody. So if somebody came up to me and said, hey, how are you doing? Donkeys are gray, horses are brown. We would never try to mechanize what we say to people, so why do we try to mechanize anything else in life? This perception is a different movement. It moves the brain differently. It moves us differently when we can actually see. Perception causes movement.